and about 45 minutes. I was thinking I would begin by making a brief remark, something I had wanted to include in my presentation, but failed to. Because it might help. It's working? Okay, good. And this comment is about an activist struggle in Australia, conducted by an organization both Gina and I work with, called Sisters Inside. It is an anti-prison organization that works on issues related to women in prison. A few years ago, they launched a campaign called Stop State Sexual Assault. Stop State Sexual Assault. And what they refer to in this notion of state sexual assault is the strip searching that goes on in women's prisons all over the world. Strip searching and cavity searching, which I personally experienced many times when I was in jail, is considered to be a routine practice. However, if you ask any woman who has experienced strip searching or cavity searching, it is no different from sexual assault. In this case, it is very clear that the state is the actor. The state is the agent. So it helps us to think about how we might bring together experiences of intimate violence and experiences of state violence. Now, one of the questions which I was handed has to do with, expand on the punishment continuum and the experience of violence of trans communities. And I think the person who asked this question is interested in the different F to M or M to F trans experiences of violence. I want to refer you, who asked the question?
¿Quién hizo la pregunta?
Okay.
Allá.
Okay, so I want to refer you to an article, a very interesting article that was published last year. And Gina, perhaps you can write the name on the board. It's an article by Julia Sudbury. And it is called Maroon Abolitionists, Black gender-oppressed activists in the anti-prison movement in the US and Canada. Okay, Black gender-oppressed activists in the US, activists in the US and Canada. In the US, in the anti-prison movement. And this article, oh, you can't read it. Okay, the title is Julia Sudbury is the author. And the article focuses on examples of gender policing within women's prisons of F to M trans prisoners. One of the things that she points out, and it's so petty, is that trans prisoners are policed with respect to the underwear they wear. And so the prisons do not allow trans men who are in women's prisons to wear men's underwear. And it sounds petty, but that process can produce violence, and has. And I wanted us to think about the larger implications of the gender policing that happens in both men's prisons and women's prisons. And to think about the violence with which the gender binary is maintained. And also to think about the apparatus of the prison as a gender policing apparatus. There are women's prisons, right? And there are men's prisons, right? But what about people who go to prison who identify either as trans men or trans women, or as gender non-conforming? And so we begin to recognize the extent to which the prison system helps to uphold and reproduce the gender ideologies that shape people's lives everywhere. So this is an example of why it might be important to examine the state violence that particularly is enacted through the prison system and how it affects everyone, regardless of your status as a prisoner or non-prisoner, or trans person or not a trans person. Okay. Yeah, and let me just add, because I know, Ochi, you asked a question about homophobia. And if one looks at the extent to which prisons have become, or have always been, institutions of violence directed against men and women who identify as gay or lesbian or bi. As a matter of fact, in a book written by a historian who studies the relationship between the women's movement and women's prisons. She discusses the intersections between race and sexuality. And that historically, often in prisons, the racial segregation, yeah. points out. It'll come to me, yeah. But she points out that the racial segregation in many women's prisons often represented an attempt to prevent sexual activity that was interracial. That is to say, sexual relations between white women and black women. And so this is also a really interesting intersection of race and sexuality, and and it demonstrates the need to think very seriously about the way in which sexuality has constructed notions of race and vice versa. Okay, this is a question about making a connection between black feminism and anti-militarist feminist struggles. And who asked that question? Okay. Oh, this is your question. Oh, is this your question, Rosie?
Sí, es.
Okay.
Bueno, es parte, ¿puedo explicarlo?
No.
Bueno, voy a explicarlo porque creo que es importante. Es que hablen un poco sobre la experiencia de ustedes como mujeres negras, posicionando el tema de las reivindicaciones alrededor de la raza, ¿sí? En los movimientos tanto feministas como, para tu caso, en el Partido Comunista, ¿sí?
This is a question that is very specifically about the relationship between black feminism and anti-militarist struggles. And that's...
La conexión entre black feminist y militarista.
Right. I mean, I'm sorry. I'm simply wanting to identify the person who asked the question. Now, I think that we can assume from all of the discussions we've thus far engaged in on black feminism that a black or women of color feminist approach to anti-militarism would be much more complex and complicated than simply demanding an end to war. Which of course is a good thing. But in challenging militarism, we would also have to think about the relationship between racism and militarism. And we would have to think about the ways in which women are multiply affected by militarism. So it would require us to think along the lines of a continuum. Not only opposing military violence, but opposing sexual violence. And to ask questions about the way in which sexual violence has always been an integral element of militarism. Rape as a weapon of war. And Gina, of course, spoke about the efforts to prosecute rape by the International Criminal Court.